Goodness, we have somebody from Lithuania on tonight.
Oh, wow, welcome.
Hi from out of country. Very cool. Welcome, everyone. I think we could probably get started. It's 4 p.m. on my end. Does that sound good?
Yep, sounds good to me.
So if you're just tuning on and you want to put your name and where you're from in the chat box, please feel free to do that. We're going to start introductions and then pass it over to Danielle. So this is a Friends from the Field webinar, and we were trying to decide, I think it's like our 25th. We started doing them in April after COVID. If this is your first time joining us, this is a series co-hosted by Blue Hill Heritage Trust, which is a community conservation organization for the Blue Hill Peninsula in Maine, and Island Heritage Trust, which is a land trust for Deer Isle, Stonington, and the surrounding islands. And it's been a really, really fun collaboration so far. And we have a bunch of past recordings on our respective websites if you want to check out those. So I think I'll pass it over to Jake for some tech, and then I'll introduce our speaker.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight, and thank you, Lander. A couple of important features for you while you're viewing. The chat box is a great way to communicate and ask questions throughout the presentation, and that button should be in the center bottom of your screen. You feel free to ask Danielle questions throughout the presentation, but we'll save everything for the last bit, maybe the last 10 or 15 minutes. And Lander and I will do our best to go through in chronological order and ask your questions on your behalf. If you'd like to ask Danielle your question directly, there is a little hand, raise your hand feature that you can click, and it will turn blue, I believe, when it's your turn. And Lander will be able to give you the option to, with the audio feature, to ask Danielle your question directly. Other than that, I think we're ready to go. And thank you so much again for joining us, and I'll hand it back over to Lander.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake. I also just realized if you have trouble finding the little blue hand, just ask us in the chat box. I'm kind of forgetting at the moment myself where it is. But if you have questions about that, exactly where it is, just put that in the chat box and Jake can answer that.
I actually don't know if it shows up on our screens as panelists, Lander, but I do believe, and by all means, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think it is in the bottom bar, the same spot where they would find the chat box. And like I said, if I'm wrong, please let somebody let me know. But
from my past experience, if you go to the participants, maybe it might be there.
Oh, okay. And the participants on my screen is right next to the chat box, so you can utilize both of those features. And Danielle, I think you're right, because I see a little blue hand at the top there for us. So
awesome.
Right. If when the time comes, if anybody's having trouble, please communicate in the chat box, and we will iron that out. But I think it should be good.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both of you. And I see people are chiming in the chat box as well, telling us where they can see it. I was on something this morning where there was a lot of confusion, so I just wanted to make sure that everyone was good. So I'm going to introduce Danielle now. Danielle D'Auria, I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong, even though you just told me. Okay, good. Is a wildlife biologist working in the research and assessment section of Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife in Bangor, and focuses on statewide populations of colonial wading birds, secretive marsh birds, black terns and loons, as well as land management issues affecting wetland habitats. And we are so excited to have her here tonight to learn more about where great blue herons go in winter and all the work that she has been doing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to everybody. I haven't even been able to get through all the participants, but I know there's some folks out there that are some of my volunteers and people that I've worked with before. So thank you everybody for joining me tonight or this afternoon. It feels like night because it's so dark out. But so I'll start sharing my screen and take it away here. 1 second. We're gonna go here. Oops, hold on 1 sec. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay. Please let me know if you can't see anything or you can't hear me. But like I said, so I'm Danielle D'Auria, wildlife biologist with Inland Fisheries and Wildlife in Maine. And today I'm going to talk to you about all the work that we've been doing, focusing on great blue herons in the state. Just an overview, I'll touch on some natural history information, get into the status of this species in our state, and then our monitoring efforts that we've been doing, some of the research we've done, just little tidbits on that, and then get into a big project that we've been doing the last few years with GPS tagging herons. So it's called our Heron Tracking Project. And most people are familiar with herons. They're large birds that are pretty easy to identify. They're as tall as 3 or 4 feet, and their wingspan is pretty large, 5 to 6 feet. But they're pretty lightweight birds, only weighing about 5 to 6 pounds. But they're kind of in the middle as far as their range of lifespan. So they can live anywhere between 10 and 15 years or so. So they're kind of mid-range as far as birds go. Most people are familiar with how to identify them, but just some of the field marks, they're overall gray in color. They have a long neck, legs, bill, these beautiful plumes that they use during the breeding season to attract and communicate with their mates. They have yellow eyes. They've got these cinnamon thighs on their legs and the wrists of their wings. So just a couple of field marks not many people think about when they think of great blue herons. And then, you know, they're obviously not in the songbird family. They are not very melodious with their calls. They will squawk quite a bit, and I'm going to play a series of calls. Hopefully everybody can hear that. So that last bit that you heard was actually a male and female greeting each other at the nest, and they do that kind of howling sound, which is always fun to be able to witness. And where do they live? Primarily North America. They go into Central America, and then part of just the little tip of South America, and then the islands, Cuba, into Haiti, the Antilles, the Bahamas in winter. And they're colonial nesters. So that means they're nesting in groups. And this is a very typical looking colony for Maine, where they use beaver flowages a lot of the time and nest in these dead standing trees called snags. But they'll also nest in the treetops of live trees. This is a white pine stand where you can kind of see the gray little bits. Those are all heron nests in the tops of those trees. And they also nest on our coastal islands. The trees on most of these islands are a little less robust than the white pines that you'd have on the mainland, but it's amazing what these birds can do and where they can build their nests. And this is what a typical nest tree might look like. They often build multiple nests in the single tree, and we call these heron condos, or at least I do. And really, it's a safety in numbers kind of situation for them. They like to have other birds around that can kind of alert them to predators that might be in the area or other disturbances. And so during incubation, you might not even realize that the birds are there unless they get disturbed, because even though they're 3 feet tall, 5 to 6 foot wingspan, they can fold themselves up very compactly into those nests. And so here I've circled little heads that are just peering over the nest, and these are adults that are incubating. So you can see their orange bill and the white and black of their heads just peering out over the edge. So after they lay their eggs, usually they lay their eggs sometime in late April, early May, and then they lay anywhere up to 5 eggs usually. They hatch after about 28 days, and these eggs are pretty small considering the size of this bird. They're about the size of a chicken egg that you get in the grocery store. So they start out really small as well. You can see 2 fuzzy heads there for nestlings. but then they grow, and it takes them about 2 to 3 months to reach the age where they can fledge and fly from the nest. So they're in those nests for quite a long time, growing quite a bit over a long period. And they get to the point where sometimes you can't even tell what a juvenile looks like compared to an adult. There's certain field marks you can look for. The juveniles have an all gray crown. And if you can see my pointer, I'm kind of pointing that out here. This is the adult on the far right. And what that young bird is doing is grabbing the adult's bill. And that's kind of one of the things they do when they want to be fed, is they pull the adult's beak down into the nest, and that kind of stimulates the adult to regurgitate its food for the young to eat. So that was just a little bit about their nesting natural history, and I just wanted to touch on what their status is here in Maine. So despite being somewhat widespread throughout the state, we recognized that we had some gaps in our knowledge back in 2007 when we kind of reviewed this species to determine what its status was. And we also at that time looked at other data sources, such as the breeding bird survey and some coastal breeding surveys we had done, kind of focused on our coastal islands. And a lot of information was kind of pointing to actually declines going on the coastal part of their breeding population. And also a decline was even being seen with the breeding bird surveys that were done statewide. So because of all this, they were listed in our state as a species of special concern, which is really, it's not a regulatory listing, it's more of just like a watch list, and it allows us to devote some resources to investigating these birds further and getting a better idea of what's happening with their population. So one of the first tasks I decided to do was to take a look at all of the historic sites that we knew about in the state and see, you know, when were they last active, or what kind of knowledge we had. And we realized a lot of our colonies had not been surveyed in a long time. There were a lot of colonies that were no longer active. So we did a survey and primarily used little fixed wing airplanes there, like you see there, to try to cover a lot of ground. Basically try to cover the whole state to some degree, going to all those points on the map and then looking for things in between to see if we could find any new colonies. But we quickly realized that the state of Maine is very large. There's lots of wetlands all throughout our state, and lots of potential nesting habitats. So in order to kind of get a good handle on what these birds were doing on a statewide basis, and then over time, we thought, let's see if we can get some help from volunteers. So we started a citizen science project called the Heron Observation Network. And this is where volunteers adopt a colony. They monitor that colony during the nesting season, as long as it doesn't disturb the birds, as long as their presence doesn't disturb the birds. They can go to that site, write down how many nests are there, how many are being used by herons, and then even record things like how many nestlings each nest has. And that gives us an idea of productivity as well as just whether or not they're active. The nice thing about a citizen science project is that the volunteer hours and even the mileage that people drive in order to get to these sites, we can use that as match for other federal funds. And that's enabled us to do other research looking at these birds and trying to understand what they're doing across the state. So from all the information from our volunteers over the years, we started that program in 2009. And we are still continuing it, although I don't have 2020 data on there. But really what we're seeing is somewhat of a fluctuating statewide population. But in recent years, since really 2016 or 15, we've actually seen a decline going on. And it'll be interesting to see if that decline continues. And that is not just on the coast, but statewide. And then from the beginning of when we started the program, we have seen that our coastal population is still declining. So to take a closer look at that, we had started out, you know, some of our earlier data is from the 1980s. We had 20 active colonies on our coastal islands with over 1,200 active pairs. And then as recent as 2019, we're down to about 6 on our islands with only about 100 pairs. And so one of the big questions that we have in our mind is why the coastal decline, and is that decline going on statewide? For the most part, we don't think the decline statewide is as severe as the coastal decline, but it's still really difficult to tell what's happening because these colonies do move around a bit. They're ephemeral, so some years they may be nesting there, some years they may not. And where do those birds go when they leave a colony? Sometimes it takes a while for us to find where they might have relocated to. So it's a little bit of a moving target. But this data does point to a bit of a decline going on statewide, but a very severe decline on our coastal islands. Some other questions that we've tried to look at is there a difference between our coastal breeding sites and our inland sites? And we had a grad student working on that one year, and she really didn't find a difference between like the productivity of those sites, whether or not the nests were successful and how many chicks they had. But she did, you know, get to look at some other information regarding nest survival, and that has just contributed to our knowledge of these birds. We've also done some pretty detailed looks at productivity and how successful our nests are compared to what's been seen in the literature. And really, we're not seeing any marked differences between our breeding birds, our breeding herons. They don't have a lower fledging rate necessarily or a lower hatch rate. So we don't think there's a problem there. Other things that we looked at, so some of our colonies we were noticing would fail year after year. So they'd get started up in April and May, they'd be on eggs, they might even start to hatch, and then within a week that whole colony would be gone. No more birds, no more active nests. And then it would happen year after year. So we decided to look at those specific colonies and put up time-lapse cameras and sound recorders to see if we could detect what might be causing these failures. And our time-lapse cameras, they don't operate at night because they're trying to get a wide-angle view of the colony itself. But our sound recorders did operate at all hours of the day. And that's where we got some clues as to what might be going on. And we heard on our sound recordings repeated distress calls by the adults at night, in the middle of the night, for many hours on end, off and on, for several days in a row at several of these colonies. And our best guess, based on that kind of behavior and no other clues indicating, you know, it could have been an owl or something else like that, we're pretty sure it was something like a raccoon that was probably raiding the nests, and maybe even a family of raccoons in that area that were going from nest to nest and kind of actually killing off the nestlings. So that was really interesting, and it went to show that, you know, certain sites could have certain issues like raccoons if there's a decent raccoon population there, but I don't think that's what's causing you know, necessarily the coastal decline or even the little bit of decline that we're seeing on a statewide basis. I just think it could be one factor in a localized area. So another thing that is a little frustrating with doing citizen science is because not everybody always gets out to their colony, or because you don't have complete statewide coverage, or you don't have a good random sample, it's really hard to get at a solid population estimate. So instead of relying on just the volunteer data for that, we actually use the volunteer data to supplement this design survey called Dual Frame Survey, where we actually go out to known colonies, and we also search random plots throughout the state for new colonies. And that information combined, we're able to get an actual estimate for the state. And we can even look at areas of the state to see how they compare. So in 2015, we did this all using aerial survey, and we came up with 1,593 nesting pairs for the entire state. We wanted to repeat it in 2020. That didn't happen. We actually weren't ready for it resource-wise, but we were hoping to do it in 2021, but that might not happen due to the pandemic. So hopefully in 2022, we can repeat that survey and then see if there's actually a trend going on, whether it's statewide or looking at that coastal trend, or even we've broken out the state into 3 different stratums. So there's north and down east, south central, and coastal. So we're really looking forward to doing that again and seeing what that tells us. So, you know, with any species or topic that you start, you know, digging into, you quickly realize that there's just more questions than answers. And some of the questions that we had were pretty basic things about, you know, the heron's life cycle and what they do and where they go and how they're using the habitats on the landscape. So all these things kind of led us to think, well, maybe if we tagged some birds, we could start getting at some of these answers. So this is where the heron tracking project kind of began. And that started in 2016, where we partnered with Lenoir Rhyne University in North Carolina, who's done some of this type of work with both great egrets and great blue herons. And we got a grant from the Outdoor Heritage Fund to deploy 5 solar-powered GPS transmitters. These transmitters collect GPS data as often as every 5 minutes if they're fully charged. And they're solar-powered, so they will recharge on a daily basis. They're supposed to last at least 3 years. We have 2 that are still going. It's been over 4 years. And part of this project was focused on involving students at all stages of the project. So really involving an educational component, trying to connect people, kids in general, but students of all ages, to the herons and the habitats that they're using. So what we first set out to do, in order to get a tag on a heron, you first have to capture one. And in order to capture one, you have to understand their habits. We didn't want to disturb them at their colony sites, so instead we decided to focus on where they're foraging away from their colony. They tend to be territorial where they forage, and they also are very habitual in the places that they use for feeding. So we had students going out and on the landscape and looking for herons in wetlands, and once they did find herons that were feeding in a specific spot, we would set out to bait that heron to come back to that spot all the time. So we wanted to create a situation where that heron wanted to return repeatedly to that specific location. So we have a cement mixing tub that we drill lots of holes in, and we catch bait fish using minnow traps, and we stock that bait bin with all of those minnows. And it's supposed to be an enticing meal that a heron cannot give up. It cannot resist. So once we know that herons, you know, we found a place to bait, we put out our bait bin. We also monitor the bait bin with game cameras. And once we see that herons are coming into those bait bins and feeding actually out of the bait bin, we're ready to set our traps and wait for a heron to come towards the bait bin to get its leg trapped. These traps that we're setting, we set anywhere between 2 and 3 dozen foothold traps. They're modified foothold traps that have reduced spring tension, they're padded, and they're gapped so that when they do close on the heron's leg, there is no injury. Oh, and this is what our monitoring the bait looks like. We have these game cameras up. You can see at this bait bin, we had 3 birds hanging out. And then this bait bin on the bottom, you can see our game cameras showed us that that bird was actually feeding out of the bait bin. So we were ready to set our traps. These are the traps again. So once we set those traps, we are always watching that bait bin and those traps to make sure that, you know, we're there when something gets caught, whether it's a heron, and we wouldn't want anything else to get caught, so we would shoo any other wildlife or critters away. Once a heron is caught, we run out, get the bird's leg out of the trap, put a hood over it, and then start handling it, and so that we can put a transmitter on it. And the transmitter looks like this. It's a little box with a solar panel and 3 antennas. And it's put on with some really strong Teflon ribbon. And it's meant to stay on the bird forever. We don't want the ribbon to fray, because if it were to fray, it might fray only partially and then hang off partially on the bird. So the safest thing for the bird is to have that transmitter be somewhat of a permanent fixture for that bird. And then here's a release video. This is one of our birds in Palmyra. Her name was Nokomis. All of the birds get named by the students that we work with. And this bird was caught even before sunrise. The sun isn't even up yet. And we were able to release her before the sun was fully up. And her tag is still going, and I'll tell you a little bit about her. So once we release the bird, then that transmitter is collecting data. And every evening around 6 o'clock, these transmitters make a connection through the cell towers and download all the data to an open source website called MoveBank. And that's where you and I, anybody can go and look at where our birds have been. You could download the data into GIS, Excel, Google Earth, and look at it and play around with it and, you know, analyze it. Ask questions about it and see what the data can tell you. So this is just what it looks like to look it up on MoveBank on the left. This is one of our birds that winters in Florida, in Vero Beach. And on the right, there's actually a smartphone app called Animal Tracker that you can also view the birds. So you can see the movements of this bird. It roosted on an island in the middle of the river and then would go to people's docks and these little channels to feed during the day. Here are all the birds that we've caught and tagged so far. Not all of these transmitters are still going, and we only have 3 currently, but Snark and Sedgy were both males. Cornelia, Mellow, and Nokomis are all females. Snipe, Warrior, these are all females as well. Easton's Baby Blue and Harper are all females. Easton's Baby Blue was actually a young of the year bird that we caught and tagged in September. So we had never caught or tagged a young of the year bird. So that was a new experience. But Harper's one of ours that's still transmitting, as well as Nokomis and Cornelia. So some of the information we can gather from these tags is kind of the timing and duration for their different seasons. And this was just that first year of data that I looked at, but you can see there's some variability in when they might start or stop breeding. There's variability in how long they go to their wintering area. And sometimes there's patterns that you can see too as to like when they're migrating back to their breeding areas. And then we can look at detailed information of where these birds are hanging out while they're here in Maine. So what habitats are they using? And this is Sedgy's movements during the nesting season. And you can see there's kind of a cluster here. That's where he nested. And then he went along this stream, the Great Work stream, to forage. And we can look at, you know, how many acres is this bird using? And during the breeding season, he was using about 689 acres. And his favorite spot was where this orange color is. And that's where his colony is. So he was going 2 miles or more to forage from his colony. But we can also compare after he's done breeding and he doesn't have any young to feed, we can look at how many acres he needs then. And it actually is quite a bit less, almost half. So, and that makes a lot of sense. He's no longer going back to his colony and he doesn't need to feed any mouths anymore. So he is just kind of focused on his own well-being here. So, but he also still had that favorite spot that he was foraging in even after the breeding season. We can compare, you know, individuals. So Cornelia did a different thing during breeding. She nested in a colony in gray, which is at the bottom of the screen, but she flew over other lakes and wetlands to the north end of Sabbath Day Pond to feed. But she used a much smaller area. So this tells me that that area at the north end of Sabbath Day Pond must be very productive as far as food goes for her. For her to be willing to fly over 6 miles to get there and then only need to use a small space, that tells me that foraging area was much more high quality. And then after breeding, she also did something different where she took off to the east, 18.5 miles, and hung out there the rest of the season before migrating. So it's interesting to see how the birds compare to each other. Our first bird to migrate with one of these tags on was Sedgy, and he was very interesting in that he left Maine very early, at least early in my mind as far as heron migration. He left on the 1st of September, and he only took 4 days to get down to Florida. So that was pretty remarkable. It was really exciting, the first bird that we tracked on migration, and you can see his track there. Our other birds, we have some mixed data or missing data. Those straight lines that you see on the map are actually just connecting points. But we do know that they wintered in not only Florida, but the Bahamas, Cuba, and Haiti. So that was really exciting to see where these birds go. Florida made sense to me when I saw Sedgy went there, but then to see all these other places and as far away as Haiti was really pretty exciting. So then, you know, they spent the winter in these warm, nice, sunny places. Their transmitters are charged up, and we got really good migration tracks for them coming back in the spring. And one of the things that we can look at is the timing of that migration. And you can see they all left around the end of March. And again, a little bit of variability. Sedgy only took 5 days to get here. He's like the marathon sprinter. But the others took on average 2 weeks or so to get back to Maine for breeding. There's a lot of information we can pull from this about their timing and length of migration. It really appears that weather in any given year might influence how long it takes them to migrate. There's patterns within individuals when they leave for migration, when they arrive, how long it takes them. And then there's also variability among individuals. Like I mentioned, Sedgy only took 5 or 6 days, and that is really different than the other birds. And then we think that the timing is a little more consistent in the spring, and this might be due to their drive to come back and reproduce, to get back to their colonies, find a prime nesting spot. They need to be kind of the first one there to get that prime real estate so they can start breeding. So then we can also look at stopover information. How many places are they stopping on their journeys? An average of 10. How often are they stopping? Is spring different than the fall? And it seems like they stop more in the spring, but for a shorter amount of time. And Sedgy, again, was an exception in many ways, stopped less stopovers and for less amount of time. And this is just looking at a couple tracks, so both the fall and spring migration tracks for 2 different birds, comparing blue versus pink or purple there. And it's just some other questions that come up. Are there similarities between their stopovers? Are any of these stopovers used repeatedly? We haven't dived into that data yet, but we hope to. But you can see that there is still variability even among the individual themselves. So I thought I'd share where they winter and just what that habitat looks like, at least from an aerial photo standpoint. Sedgy and Snark both wintered in Florida, only 30 miles apart. Sedgy's area was kind of an agricultural area using these ditches along farmland. And then Snark's area, like I mentioned before, was in Vero Beach, very urban, using these very populated areas, so quite different. And Snark was actually photographed by one of our volunteers who went down to winter. He went down there during the winter and found him and took some photographs for us. So Nokomis is the one that goes to Haiti. and her transmitter's still going. She ends up in this very remote area, kind of along this river valley. And I'll zoom in here, and what we can tell from some of the information out there on the internet is that we're pretty sure this is rice paddy plantations, and rice paddies can be very important for a lot of wading birds. There's a lot of fish and amphibians that are in these areas. So, and she has gone back to this same area. This will be her 5th winter, I believe, there. So really a lot of fidelity to where they're going in the winter. And this is just to show you what it looks like on the app that's on the smartphone. This is Nokomis in Haiti, and this was just a 2-week period in 2019 in the winter, but just to give you an idea what that looks like. So now I'm going to talk about Harper, which is our most recently tagged bird. We tagged her in Harpswell in 2019, and our goal of working in Harpswell was to really try to get a coastal nesting bird, because we're so interested in the decline that's going on the coast and how that she might compare to some of our inland nesting birds. So after we tagged her, in the first 10 days of her movements, we saw no sign of nesting. She had normal foraging movements. Everything was in 3 miles, but she wasn't going out to one of our known colonies. There's no sign that she was nesting. So we thought maybe she's past the prime breeding age, or maybe she's a young bird, a 2-year-old who's not nesting yet. We assumed that at the end of May in Maine, all of our herons are nesting. Most of them have young at that time. So we assumed that she was just not a breeder. So we thought maybe she'll nest in Harpswell next year. That was our hope. But she then took off in the beginning of June to northern New Brunswick. And so then we thought, well, maybe she's from away. So she did a beeline for northern New Brunswick, and then started kind of going along the coast up there, not really showing any signs of nesting. But she was kind of what we think prospecting for a nesting area, because those yellow push pins that you see in the map are actually known great blue heron colonies. And she visited several of those. And then I'll share, I have another slide that will show this later, but she actually ended up nesting in one of those the next year. But what was interesting first is her first tracked migration south wowed everybody. She actually did this long over the open ocean flight for 38 hours. She flew from New Brunswick all the way to Florida, and then she went on to Cuba. And so this was really an impressive flight that she did. We could see from her transmitter her speeds and how high she was. And it was just really something that wowed us. We hadn't seen any of our other birds do this long of a flight and over the open ocean. So it was pretty exciting. And then to see that she went to Cuba. So then, like I said, she came back north in the spring, but she didn't stay to come to Maine. She actually stopped a little bit in eastern Maine, but kept going to New Brunswick. And this is what we think happened. So she ended up at a colony known as the Fox Island Heron Colony, one that she had visited the year before, possibly during her prospecting period. And we're pretty sure she nested there, because the dates of her visiting this probable nest location all make sense. So that was pretty neat to see that unfold. Her story has been unfolding before our eyes, and it will continue to as time goes on. And then again, she wowed us when she went south this fall. She left southern Quebec, so on Chaleur Bay, on October 8th, and this time flew continuously for 68 hours over the open ocean, going almost as far as Bermuda, and then heading back to the west, inland to Florida. Well, actually, she landed in Georgia first and then made her way down to the Everglades. We actually haven't heard from her transmitter since late October, and we're hoping that all that means is that she's in an area without cell coverage, because that does happen with some of our birds, especially the one that goes to the Bahamas. We don't hear from her all winter, And then once she pops into cell range again, we get a big dump of data, and then we see what she has done the last 3 or 4 months. So we're really hoping that that's what's going on with Harper's transmitter, and that we'll see her pop up again here. If not this winter, we'll see her pop up in the spring when she comes to migrate north again. So one of the questions that comes up with the flight over the open ocean is, could she have been like taking a rest or touching down on the water or a ship? But our transmitters actually have accelerometers in them, which is kind of like having a Fitbit. So it's monitoring the activity of the bird, and you can see all of that activity by this graph in between when she took off on the 8th and then landed on the 11th in Georgia. So that's how we know she flew that whole time. And then just looking at some of her altitude and her speed during that flight, this graph, the things to pay attention to are the size of the dot means, the bigger means she was higher up. Her elevation or her altitude was higher. And then the color, the closer it gets to orange or yellow, the faster she was going. So this just gives you an idea that it did vary across her flight. But you can see where she got some altitude and might have been flying faster, and then areas where she ended up flying slower and lower. And then we can also look at, she flew, lower during the nighttime hours. There was some evidence that she was actually gliding from these high altitudes to the low altitudes, which you could see with her accelerometer. And most of the time she was below 1,000 feet. So, that big wide arc of her path, makes us think, well, what causes her to go that far out? And I really think wind speed and direction plays a big role. And so what I did, I went on this website and looked at the wind speed and direction at her elevation on the different days where she was along her path, and tried to map out how that looks in relation to her location at that time. So I have a little video that kind of puts those maps all together. I'll play that. So when she left, the winds were coming out of the northwest, pushing her that direction, and then they start to kind of switch as she's going further south, and then they're pushing her back in towards the US. So it all makes perfect sense that she did that path after seeing these maps. So that's kind of the end of all the tracking information, except I do want to mention that we are always looking for more students and teachers to get involved. We will probably try to put out another transmitter this coming spring, but this data is available to anybody who's interested. We would love students to use it for projects, whether it's even 4th graders we've had doing their own projects, looking at the data in Google Earth, up to college level. So definitely contact me if you want to get involved, and we can brainstorm lots of ideas. So before I finish, just want to mention that we do have a blog or website with articles that we write regularly about the project, as well as a Facebook page. The Facebook page is the best way to hear updates about our tagged birds. And then lots of people, of course, helped make all of this happen and continue to help us make all this happen. We have lots of heron volunteers. Some of them are on the call tonight, but we really couldn't do this without a big collaborative of all these different students, teachers, volunteers, land trusts, you name it. And of course, funding. Funding is always an issue with non-game species, trying to, be creative in how we fund some of this work. So these are all the sources that go into this kind of work. And Maine birder bands are a great one to support all Maine work, all bird work in Maine. They go towards many different projects that focus on birds here. Just want to close by mentioning our other big citizen science project, the Maine Bird Atlas, which we're always looking for more volunteers. If you're a birder, or even if you just like to look at birds in your backyard, you might be able to contribute to this project. So Maine Bird Atlas. You could Google it, and there's all sorts of instructions on how to get involved. And that's all I have, but hope to be able to answer any questions that people have, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And hopefully we do have time.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was amazing. So incredible. And I took down a bunch of the resources you shared so I can send them out in a follow-up email to everyone who has registered. That just totally blew my mind. That was an incredible story that you just shared with us. Thank you so much. Yeah. We do have questions in the chat box, so maybe Jake and I will bounce back and forth there for a minute, and then if people also want to raise their little blue hand. I do notice we have 2 blue hands in the chat box already, so Pat and Kate, if you wanted to have those up, okay, Pat's just disappeared. Sometimes it's old or a mistake, but if you'd like to put your hand up there, I'll keep an eye on that as well. Let's see. Jake, do you want to get started in the chat box, or do you want me to?
Let's start with a raised hand. That's exciting because we don't always get raised hands on it.
Well, so I think that we do have a raised hand. We just had another one pop up. Awesome. Okay, I think they just disappeared. Maybe it was an accident.
All right, that's okay. I have a question queued up for you, Danielle. Ed and Debbie were wondering if bald eagles are affecting the great blue heron populations, and maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I didn't really touch on that. It's a good question. There's always so much I want to jam into these presentations. So that's one of what we think it could be driving the coastal decline. Where we've had heron colonies on our coast, on those islands that are no longer heron colonies, a lot of those host eagle nests. And as many of you know, eagles have recovered amazingly in Maine, but their increased population has put some pressures on other species like herons. So eagles will predate both adults and young herons, and even just them flying through a colony can cause a big disturbance to that colony. It can cause young to jump out of nests and meet their deathly fate. But so one of the things that it's been hard to really pinpoint that as a cause, but we do think it's a factor because we've had many observations of that happening. We've had colonies where we've gone in on the ground after the nesting season, have found eagle feathers as well as dead herons. And so I think that it's definitely a factor. We also think that they might be just pushing the herons from the coast inland. So herons may be trying to get away from eagles on the coast and then choosing to nest inland instead. So it's hard to pinpoint it for sure, but it's definitely a factor.
Well, we're glad to hear that the eagles are doing better, but
yeah, it's it's hard. We wanted our eagles back, but then sometimes you get other issues.
The great herons can hold their own. Lander, do we have a raised hand, or?
We don't have any hands yet, but I can ask another question in the chat box. We're kind of bouncing around today. Sometimes we go in chronological order, but we'll bounce around a little bit. So do you think the birds are facing declines in the conditions or food sources, or maybe exposure to plastics they find in Florida and the Caribbean?
Yeah, so they could be definitely facing certain limiting factors in their wintering areas or even along migration. You know, migration's a pretty risky undertaking for any bird. All sorts of things can happen. They tend to migrate during the hurricane season. Weather can be a big factor. You know, whenever you're moving outside of a place that's comfortable for you as a bird, you have lots of things that you might not be used to that could be, you know, things that you could run into that you're not expecting. I know down in the Caribbean in some places, people have told me they're worried about our birds at winter down there because people will shoot birds and actually eat them down there. So there's those things that are going on in places other than Maine that could be affecting them. But in Maine, yes, I think food source, and that could be one reason eagles might be turning to species like herons or ospreys or other seabird nesting, you know, other island nesting seabirds Whereas if the food resource, meaning the fisheries resource that we have here, is suffering in any way, which we do know there's been declines in some areas, that could be forcing them to shift to other prey sources and seeing herons as an easier target than trying to find an abundant other prey source. So.
Thanks, Danielle. There was a little bit of concern, and hopefully you can clear this up, about the trackers and how they may cause like interference with their freedom and range of motion, movement.
Yeah, so as with any tag or anything that you attach to a bird, even a leg band can cause problems for them, potentially. So with these transmitters, we have actually had some issues. It's a new technology that we're using, and attachment methods for new technologies are always something that can be challenging at first. So, from 2014, I would say, is when we started, not me, but other researchers had started using these transmitters and attaching them to great egrets and great blue herons. And over time, we try to hone our techniques and modify things to make sure that they're safe and good for the birds. So we have had some issues with both the material that we've used in the, for the harness. We had switched to a new material from the Teflon, and then found that one wasn't doing as well. So we had to switch back, change to sewing them on instead of using metal clips, because metal clips can cause fraying. But as far as the mobility of the birds, we don't see any signs that these transmitters and the way they're attached, where they're attached like a backpack, we don't see any sign that they're actually causing any mobility problems. It's more of just whether those straps are going to fray, and if that happens, that can really cause a problem for a bird. If you have a strap hanging off, or anything dangling that could get caught on anything, could be a problem. So, but we're always worried about that. We're always concerned about that, and we do our best to try to modify and consult with all the other researchers out there that have experience with these techniques and try to perfect them. But this is one of the things with new technology and new methods, is there's always a little bit of a learning curve and trial and error, unfortunately, but hopefully that what we learn from the birds will kind of benefit them more in the long run.
Thanks for sharing about that, Danielle. We have a couple kind of similar questions in the chat box. One about, what was the mobile app called again? Was that the animal tracker? Okay.
Yeah, it's called Animal Tracker. The only thing is Harper is not on there yet. We need to add her to it, but our other birds are, so.
Okay, awesome. I'll put that in the follow-up email, everyone, just in case you don't get it right now. And then somebody was wondering, how do we get in touch with you, maybe for citizen science or other questions? And then also a question about an eBird app, and if that works.
Yeah, so for me, I can even put my email address in the chat if you'd like, although it says, can I do that to everybody? I'm not sure I can, but you could always share my email with them too if you follow up with an email. I'm happy to answer any further questions if you want to get involved, or even just have a conversation about anything. What was the second thing? Oh, eBird. So there's an eBird app you can use on your smartphone. You can also do on the internet on your computer. And that's what I'm mentioning eBird for, would be more like for the Maine Bird Atlas. I don't use it for my tracking project per se, so I'm not sure what the specific question was about eBird.
Let's see if I can find it. In the meanwhile, Jake, do you want to ask another question that's come up? We have about 5 minutes left.
I kind of skimmed through, and Janet had a good question about sea level rise due to climate change. Is that affecting the coastal birds in any significant way? And maybe that has something to do with their change in nesting sites? Yeah,
so right now, I don't think it would be affecting their nesting sites necessarily. I mean, the islands where they're nesting on the coast, are, they're in the tops of the trees, kind of in the interior of the island usually. So it would have to be quite a bit of a rise to really affect that part of their life. But I think it could be affecting foraging areas. So they love to feed in estuaries. Those are such rich, abundant places to feed. And so as sea level rises, it could be changing the, changing what places are accessible for birds to be feeding. These guys are wading birds, so they wade in shallow water. So as sea level rises, that topography may change of the shoreline, and then there may not be as many accessible places for feeding, as well as, any changes that happen with temperature and salinity that could be affecting the fish or prey populations. But right now we haven't seen anything direct yet.
So I found the eBird question. It says, can you use eBird data? And if so, how?
So I've actually used eBird data kind of more just skimming and, exploring the eBird maps for species to see if there's any nesting areas that maybe I don't know about. And I found a couple last year, I think, through also through the Maine Bird Atlas, where people are recording breeding birds and they're recording breeding herons. And, some people just assume I know where everything is or where all our colonies are, but I don't necessarily. So if anybody knows of a colony, it doesn't matter if I already know about it. I'd love to hear about it just to make sure I know. But I have found one or two colonies using eBird by looking at people's observations.
Awesome. Thanks, Danielle. I'm just going to jump in with one more question, and then Jake, I'll hand it over to you again. I saw a good one in here. In what sorts of ways do you think your research will be benefiting great blue herons or conservation?
Well, I think, the main thing is to get people to understand what these birds do and where they go and their habitats that they rely on. And those habitats are really our wetland habitats, which are really important indicators of how the health of our environment is overall. So especially the tracking project, having people connect to these birds and then see where they're going, and then seeing the interconnectedness not only of what's happening in Maine, but all along the flyway, all the way down to Central America. I think it just gives people a new perspective and a new appreciation for the birds, and then realizing how it can actually connect to them and the health of where they live, and then ultimately their health. So hopefully, really getting people to understand all this interconnectedness between themselves, the birds, the habitat, and everything.
Thanks, Danielle. It's all amazing. And I have to make a note before I forget. I really enjoyed the visuals of your graphs. It made what you were saying kind of come to life in a way. We had a question from Nancy, and she was inquiring about, whether the great blue herons come in contact with the egrets. Like, is that something that potentially is an issue for them?
I don't think it's an issue. There are a couple spots in Maine, not many, where we don't have a lot of nesting egrets in Maine, but they will nest together. There's one island I can think of down in Casco Bay where we have both great egrets, snowy egrets, great blue herons, glossy ibis, kind of a mixed species colony, and that's pretty common for these birds. Again, it's, they're benefiting from having more eyes on the landscape while they're nesting, and it gives them a little extra protection from predators or potential disturbances. But, there's definitely interactions between these species, but they're nesting in sometimes the same tree. And so they're somewhat tolerant of each other to some degree. If a bird hops over to their nest, they're gonna probably defend their nest, but otherwise they're going to tolerate them being right there.
And Danielle, I want you to know that there's a lot of praise in here and a lot of thanks for your presentation. So if you don't get to see that, just know that it's there for sure. And I'll ask one more question. John asked an interesting question about whether the herons are able to sleep or rest at all during their flight migration. Like, can they kind of doze off for a little bit and take a little nap, or?
Yeah, so we don't know a lot about what any birds do while they're migrating or while they're flying as far as how much sleep they can get. There is I forget what there's a slow wave sleep or something like that. I'm not an expert in this area at all, but I've read up on it a little bit, and there's something where birds can actually turn off kind of half of their brain, have one eye open, and they're still able to do things like navigate or, fly while they're resting part of their brain. And we don't know if herons do that. It's definitely possible. But, we know that they're actively flying that whole time that Harper was migrating. So it's definitely an area where they need to do more research to understand better. And there's been some recent research with frigate birds, I think, where they're, these birds that are on the wing a lot over open ocean, they will rest while they're flying. But that's not during migration. That's their usual flight pattern. So it could be different for migration.
Awesome. Well, I'm conscious that we are at 5:01 and we still have a lot of amazing questions in the chat box. But perhaps if I send out your email, people can reach out to you if that sounds good.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, everybody. I would be willing to stay on for an hour to talk about these birds because I just really enjoy it. But definitely don't hesitate to contact me, and I can even give you you might have my phone number from my email address. You can put that in there too if they'd rather
That's
call.
very generous. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Danielle. It was awesome, and this was one of our. There was a lot of people tuned in tonight, so there's some great following on your end. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody for joining me.
Great.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Have a great night, all of you.
You too.
Thanks for tuning in.
Bye-bye.
Bye.